I would like you to design the back end of an app that lets users download their data from their Facebook account. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another mock interview with Exponent. Today, we're here with Tanya. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Nice to see you all, or not see, but nice to be with you all here. I'm Tanya. I am currently I was recently a director of engineering at Reforge and previously spent quite a few years at Twitter running all sorts of interesting backend as well as front-end teams that had both user-facing outcomes as well as some of our internal services.
Wonderful to have you with us today, Tanya. Let's dive right into the question. So my question for you today is, I would like you to design the back end of an app that lets users download their data from their Facebook account.
Sounds like a very useful service to have. Awesome.
Yeah, I wonder why.
Sounds needed. Cool. So I'm happy to dive in. I do have some clarifying questions, if that's okay. Maybe we can run through them first. Just want to make sure I'm clarifying some of my assumptions. So let's see. The main use case, as I understand it, will provide some kind of a user interface that allows users to request their copy of their Facebook data. We'll build out the backend service that does all of the processing, prepares the data for the user, and then have some sort of a front end service that lets user do the actual download and copy the data to their local environment.
Yeah.
Okay, great. A couple of clarifying questions that would be helpful for me. First is, how fresh should this data be once the user sends the request? Do we care about the freshness of the data?
I'd like to hear you talk through some options for, what would we consider here?
Okay, great. Then how fast do we have to respond to requests? Are we under any obligations to fulfill their data requests within a certain period of time?
Let's say that our promise to the user is that we can give them their data within a reasonable amount of time, being within that day that they request the data. Yes, and then from a product perspective, let's say that we want to communicate whatever amount of time it's going to take. And if you have an estimate for me for how much time it would take, I'd love to hear that.
Okay. Yeah, we can talk through some options. Then the next question I have is, do we have to include all of the data for their account, or can we give them options for what data they should be able to select?
Let's begin by listing out the kinds of things that they would be able to download, whatever you'd like to brainstorm there. And then maybe we can talk through what would be reasonable as an MVP.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. So given that we're operating within a very large application of Facebook, what assumptions can we make about a single source of truth for data versus like having to do the data discovery piece ourselves?
Talk a little bit more about the data discovery piece.
Yeah. So for example, I'm sure that Facebook has, as a Facebook user, I know Facebook has a ton of different services that they run on the back end, right? There's one for doing posts. There's probably some other ones for uploading your images. There might be some other ones for Marketplace. And so are they keeping all of user-associated data in one place, or do we kind of have to discover where we have pieces of data about the user?
Let's assume that we have to discover it.
Okay. Typically, these operations will be very expensive because you're spending a bunch of time gathering up large sets of data about the user, and then you have to store it. Do we care about the cost? Do we care about how often a user can do that, essentially? Like if we care about the cost and how long it's going to take us and the processing power behind it, we probably want to limit how long.
When you say we have to store it, what are we storing?
The gathered piece of their data that's ready for their download.
Got it. Okay.
And then we probably don't want to duplicate and generate these things on an ongoing basis. So we would like to do it when a user sends us a request to do so.
Yeah.
And that process is also probably somewhat costly. So, do we want to allow them to do this every day? Do we want to limit, depending on the data freshness piece, like we talked about?
Yeah.
want to limit how often they're storing it?
I think let's answer that question once we've answered the data freshness piece. I think we'll have a little more clarity on what limits we can draw here.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what do we as a team that's building this feature, do we know like what average percentage of users we expect to perform this action on a regular basis?
Great question. Let's assume it's a large number, but let's say 5% of users every month request to download their data.
Okay. And then I think, do we know what the average size of the download will be? Like how average size of these archives for users, or these?
I don't think so. I think we might need to do some back of the napkin estimates to come to an average. Yeah.
Okay. And then do we care what the users do with their data once they have access to it? Like how much do we care about the usability once it's in their hands?
As in how readable is that data?
That's right. Yeah.
Got it. I don't think we care. Sorry, we don't care about that as much for the beginning, but if you do have some thoughts about how to strike a balance there, I'd love to hear them.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And then so that brings me to, I think, my maybe final question on some of the required clarification is, why are we working on this? What's like the driving force behind this feature?
I'd say the primary driving force behind this feature is giving people the power to see what they have put on their profiles on Facebook. And to make it easy for them to determine what kind of control they would like to wield over that information.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, like, when we think about metrics of success, how are we thinking about them? Like, if we were to measure this feature at the end and whether we build a successful feature, what will we measure?
Great question. I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on that, and then we can maybe talk about this when we're discussing ultimately what metric we want to arrive at.
Okay. All right. So let me start screen share. And is that okay for me to look sideways? Because that's where my second screen is, and I'll be able to.
That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, totally fine.
Okay. So hopefully you're seeing a blank whimsical board.
Yeah, I see it.
So I know in the beginning we said we're designing the backend system, but I think just talking through some of the front end components will be important, because I think there's some assumption in what the front end does that we clarify as I think about designing the backend system.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so let me start off by adding a little user icon. So we have this user who's going to decide that they want to start a process of downloading their Facebook data. Okay. So we're going to make an assumption that within Facebook, there typically is some sort of a front-end service that does a lot for us, that initially takes in user requests, that will do things like load balancing, routing users to the right data center, checking in things like authorization and authentication. I don't think we're building those services right now, so we're just going to hand wave and make some assumptions that those things already exist. Is that fair?
I think that's fair.
So just going to call that out. There's a Facebook front-end service for load balancing, limiting authentication, etc. So that we know that our service doesn't really need to worry about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's someone else who's going to take care of that for us. So really, the first thing we're going to see is we're gonna, at this point, hopefully we know that it is the right user. You know, they have an account, and what we're building is this application service that will receive a request So I'm going to suggest something. So I think it will be important for us to allow users to specify the date range for the data we want to make. The reasoning behind that is it takes a lot of work to gather up all of the data, especially, we know that some accounts, let's make assumptions, some accounts are pretty old, they have a lot of data. So I think it would be beneficial for us to be able to limit how much data
You got it.
in a request.
You got it. Okay. So are you envisioning this as something where the user does not have an option to download all the data, or if they want to do that, they just have to specify like the first day that they open their account to present?
I would say that it's an option, but they should certainly have an option to download everything. So
got it. Okay. Yeah.
Just that's to make it easy for us to do less work, essentially, if we can. So
that's fair.
So we would have the user, we have a date range. And I will say that probably within our, again, an assumption I want to clarify is we probably have a lot of extra user tied data that we maybe have some inference data. We probably have a lot of like ML and stuff like that we add additional data on top of users.
Yeah.
They want to see that if they're super curious, but my guess is for most users, like they just want to get their pictures and their posts and maybe some other stuff. So giving them an option of filtering what they want to download, again, will allow us to just do less work, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that reasoning.
And then that filtered. So, yeah. Sometimes, users might not know all, so they should be able to get all of it. But I think just for the sake of, again, doing less work, this will help us do less work. I'm making a ton of other assumptions that we'll talk through in a minute. But so this is, there's a bunch of these things because we're going to be taking a lot of requests.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that we might consider as a non-functional requirement is, well, there is already a lot of authorization and authentication stuff that Facebook does for accounts. For these particular services that access personal, like a lot of user data in one go, we might actually want to add some additional checks on top or secure our service in another way. So I don't know if that would be something that you think is required for this initial phase of the launch, but something for us to consider as a security. This is probably a high sensitivity service that we need to add additional security.
You got it. Yeah. I would say, I think that's fair. I like the reasoning that you've given. Potentially one additional security check just to ensure that the user is actually who they say they are. I think that's a reasonable thing to have in place, especially if you're downloading personal information. Yeah.
Okay. So, cool. Other things that I'm thinking about that I asked a question about that maybe we should talk about. So scalability, assuming that, 5% of our users are using the service, if we know the size of our active users on Facebook, we can calculate that amount and then determine how many machines we need for both our application service as well as data processing, if we can roughly estimate the kind of the amount of data each account holds. So we'll take that into account. Some other performance implications. So the only other thing I say is like we might be under regulatory obligations, especially due to things like GDPR, to deliver this data within a certain amount of time. So for some accounts, gathering up the data might take a really long period of time. So we probably need to make a decision what happens in those cases and how we want to communicate to those users, especially if we have any kind of obligations to do so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like communicate to those users the size of the data that they're downloading, or what else would you like?
Expected, completion timeline.
Yes, that's fair.
Okay. Any other things to consider here? So yeah, on a high level, that's kind of some of the things we would have to think through. Okay, so I think the main pieces that we'll want our service to do is take in the request,
Mm-hmm.
and then let's talk a little bit about the data discovery piece. We will need some kind of a mechanism by which we can discover what data we have about every user, right? So we either need a single source of truth for mapping all the services that could potentially touch user data or that deal with user data. Maybe there is some kind of a data store that gives us that information, or another type of registry. So if there is, that's great. That's one of the ways we can use that for discovery.
Mm-hmm.
If that kind of thing doesn't exist, then frankly, we probably need to do some like human work first to figure out what are the required data pieces that we need to gather. And then if we're operating within a company like Facebook, understand what those services are, and then create a contract with those services so that they can provide us data in the format that we could potentially want.
Got it. Let's assume that we do have that mapping done and ready for you to use.
Right. So then that would be our source of truth. We would consult that mapping. So data, services, mapping. There's some kind of a service, so we would use that. We would use that mapping, and based on that, fire off my curvy little data lines are very interesting, but here we are. And fire off some requests to get data. Any questions so far?
No questions so far.
So we'll have a couple of these services. I'm just going to call them a data service because they're just going to process and return or, gather up some data that we need.
Mm-hmm.
And nice. We're going to ask them these services for data. And they're going to do two things, I think. One, they're going to send us back a completion event once they're done so we can keep track of that. So these things are getting a little bit crowded. So, and then they are also... Okay, so once, assuming that these services are going to gather up some data and dump it somewhere, we probably need to do some post-processing once all of the data is gathered up so that we can actually give it to the user in a format that they want. Because I'm assuming they don't want a bunch of object in whatever format we get it back. So
a bunch of JSON files.
Maybe that's fine, but also there's probably a bunch of duplicate data and data just maybe that doesn't make sense. So we likely probably want to do some processing. And so here we have a data processing phase. We have a couple of these. Okay, so they're going to place the data somewhere. And depending on what, how quickly we need to get this down, we could use something like my previous experience. We could use something like HDFS and MapReduce. Where we can first pre-process the data the way we want and then actually reduce it to what we need at the end. And then kind of a critical phase here is that when the data is all gathered up, it's going to be a large thing. So we probably want to compress it somehow and then store it at a location where the user can download it from. And during the download phase, a couple of things that will be important for us, again, given the size of the data, likely we need some kind of a place where they already takes care of things like restarting the downloading data in chunks. We have to account for low bandwidth because not everyone has high bandwidth.
Mm-hmm.
So if we have such a infrastructure at Facebook, which let's assume we do, because we're probably not the only service that needs to do this sort of thing, then we're just going to store it at that location,
Okay.
so that users can download it from there.
And do you have any thoughts about how long we would want to keep it at that location?
Yeah, so I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the question of how often we'd want to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes hand in hand with like how fast do we have to fulfill some of these requests. So let's say we have, 45 days to fulfill a request. I know that's kind of a ridiculous time. That's probably not very realistic. So let's go back and say we have 10 days to fulfill a data request.
Okay.
So if it takes 10 days to generate some of these like larger data pieces, and say we probably want to store it for 10 days at least.
Mm-hmm.
And because all of these processes will be asynchronous, they're probably like when you think about the data requests, they're probably not on the critical path. Like they're not the same priority as, let's say, a new post or, viewing an image or whatnot. So I think they're lower priority requests. We can kind of run them in the background as background jobs for some of these services. So we just like, I think it's fine for us to leave them there for, let's say, 30 days.
Mm-hmm.
And then delete them out, and then users can request a fresher version of their data if they need to.
What do you think are possible trade-offs of us taking longer with these requests versus prioritizing them and getting them done faster?
Just like users become impatient and don't have access to the download of their data.
Okay.
So
got it.
Customer inquiries.
How do you want to handle the data that gets added to their profile in that period of time?
I think we could have a couple of approaches. One, I think it would be hard for us to guarantee any freshness for something that's async. So let's say we have multiple data sources. From one, we might be, or, depending on how quickly can fulfill the request, it might finish in the first hour from, the request that we get from the user. Where in service might take 3 days, right? So at that point, the first job already finished, and we don't it's already kind of staler data. So I think we just wouldn't be able to guarantee the freshness of the data until the request is finished. So I think the thing that the user can do is request another version of their archive. That would be the trade-off that they're making.
Got it. And if we say we're keeping the data, you said for 30 days, then I guess the last question then becomes, how long do we want people to, or how often do we want people to be able to do this?
Yeah. So my suggestion would be that they can do this every 30 days.
Okay, got it.
Or it would go hand in hand with, if, for example, if we hear back from users that time frame is too long, I think it just goes kind of hand in hand with how quickly we delete their archive is like kind of how often we can request a new one.
I see. So basically there's a trade-off between how long we take to fulfill their request, how long we keep the data, the freshness of that data, and how often they can do this, right? Okay, I see. I think the reasoning makes sense. So let's stick with the numbers that you gave for this one.
Okay, cool. Great. Okay, these are great questions, and I think they're clarifications. And I just want to reiterate that I think we should be listening and hearing from our users, and if the timing doesn't make sense for them, I think some of the pieces we should design with that in mind.
That's fair. Yes.
scaling them in a way that we could make it faster if we needed to. But I do think there's probably a limit in terms of how fast we can fulfill some of these requests.
Yeah.
Okay. So we got our data processing. It's gonna create some data. It's gonna put it in a data store. Okay. And then, so we got the completion request. We probably want data processing requests to come back to our net, what I wanted to do. We wanted to just come back to our application. So our application service would need to keep track of all jobs that have begun, like essentially all of the requests that we have started.
Mm-hmm.
And then would need to keep track of, as it sends the request to each data service, hey, get the data. Once we get the completion request from the completion event from the data service, we also probably want to keep track, or we need to keep track of all the data processing. So once the data processing completes, so that we can notify our users that their data is ready for them to download. Another assumption that we're going to make is that there is some kind of a notification service at Facebook, because we send out a lot of notifications to our users. So there's some kind of orchestration that needs to do that all together, and we don't want to be in the business of doing that. So somewhere over here, it's a notification service. So once everything is completed, we will say, hey, could you notify our users that their data is ready? And then the notification service will send a notification. Oh, sorry. User is really far away. To our user, letting them know that their data is ready. And then they would have to go through another flow where they would go through again, log into Facebook, go to the place where they can actually see that the data is ready, and then send a download request to our data storage, and then actually download or view their data.
Got it. So where would the fail safes live for, let's say there's a failure for some reason in the middle of collecting the data that is required for one packet, right? Where would that live? And what rudimentary things could we have in place for, fail safes do we have in place for that?
That's great. That's a great, great question, and something I should have talked about. So I think our application service is kind of that main service that is taking care of all of that. And we would have to decide on either a retry mechanism, or if we are going to fulfill the user request with incomplete data. I think for most of these things, we probably can't. So that's one thing that I haven't touched on at all, is that we need some kind of a logging mechanism as well, just to log things for both metrics as well as forensics. So if we ever need to debug our system and say, hey, where did the failure occur? What happened? Of the process that happened. And then 2 for metrics. So we'd probably want to do monitoring of average job completion time. We'd probably want to do some alerting and monitoring for jobs that have taken over a certain period of time, so that we could debug the system. We probably want to have some retry mechanism for every step of this flow. If the flow fails, we probably want to retry a couple of times before we actually start manual interference. So the more we can automate these pieces within the system, the better. But sure, like any error, they can occur, and we just have to make a decision on what we want to do about that.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's fair.
Let me see if there's other things that I should think about. Yeah, and I think we haven't really talked about any kind of testing. I think with these sort of systems, there is a lot of testing that you have to do. And one of the things that you are relying a lot in, for example, in this architecture, you're relying a lot on other services to complete the requests, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if, let's say, the data service doesn't return you a complete data set, but doesn't return you a failure, those will be the kinds of things that you have to decide how you want to test and how you want to handle failures for, because you don't really own the service. And so you might not have full visibility in the kinds of things that are being returned to you and whether they're complete or not, or true or not.
Yeah, that's fair. I think one last question I have. So we were talking about the trade-off between how fast we want to be able to fulfill a request, how long we're keeping the data, freshness. So let's say we do get feedback from consumers that 10 days is just way too much time. We want to start prioritizing freshness, not just for consumer satisfaction, but also legally. We are supposed to fulfill these requests within, let's say, GDPR changes and says that we have to be able to fulfill this request within like 48 hours of someone asking for it. What would this system, if anything, what would change in the system in order to accommodate that?
Yeah. So one of the things that I talked a lot about is like, if we allow users to set date ranges and filter the list of data, especially for date ranges, you can probably do a lot more in parallel if you do chunked filtered data. So we might want to figure out, for example, if gathering up all of the data by one data service takes too long, we probably want to get it chunked or like have more services in parallel running for different date ranges. Services support date range filtering. We could scale, but I think all of our scale will be focused on essentially getting all of the relevant data for the user.
You got it. Okay.
Have it all, and we can, we might be able to, like, let's say we actually they're probably the processing pieces also, just because it's going to be working through a pretty large data set. There's probably some optimizations we want to do there. So if we're doing more async processing, let's say on like HDFS, we might want to see if there's other services that are more like, I think Apache Spark might be able to handle, is more costly, but can handle this a lot faster. So just kind of depending on what the current infrastructure is and if there are other options for us to do more processing of data faster, we could.
Got it. Okay. So chunking according to chunking in different date ranges, basically, within the ones that they've specified. Yeah. Would being able to consolidate, so within each of those date ranges, I assume there's going to be some gathering of photos, some gathering of posts, some gathering of, I don't know, your friend connections that were made in that date range. Does that slow things down, or are there more optimizations that we can make by consolidating those different types of data that are gathered?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're making a lot of, I think when I say these things, I make a lot of assumptions about how the data is sharded in the first place. So depending on how the data is, if it's already sharded differently, and this would be a lot of query time and shuffling data from one thing to another, then we consider other ways of optimizing how we gather the data. Yeah, if speed of utmost concern, we could probably also just have some of these services start, if it's only 5% of the users. So I was going to say, we could see if we just want to pre-prep some of these archives, right? For some of our users. But I think if it's only 5% of our users, that's really expensive, because we're not going to be able to necessarily guess which account. If it was 80% of our users are going to do this, then we could just start prepping these data dumps ahead of time. And then when the user requests it, it's already available. So it would be super easy. But with only 5% of our users, I think anything that we would try to guess at would be just wrong.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think that's fair. Do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's one thing that we didn't touch on at all is like the user experience of using this data. So if we think about forward-looking optimization, that's probably one of the things that I would think about how we can make better is how users experience once they have access to all of this wonderful data, how they what they do with it, and thinking about how we can build a nicer service for them there. Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to stop. And you're right. I think if we were to work on this further, I think future considerations would be, well, why are users downloading this in the first place? What are they going to use it for? What is the best format to present them this data with? And one of the questions you asked initially, like, what assumptions are we making about what is a metric of success here? Yeah. Is it just how many people request to download their data? Or is it whether if someone sends in a request, do they actually come back and download the data that they have requested for? So yeah, I think that's a consideration that we would dive a little bit deeper into if we were working on this. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, Tanya. How do you think that went?
I think it went well. Yeah, just a ton to consider and a ton of assumptions, I think, being made in the design phase. Mm-hmm. So definitely feels a little like the more you know, kind of the better system you can design. But yeah, overall, I think a good starting point.
Yeah, I think so. A couple of things that I noticed that you did really well, like you said, there's a lot of assumptions that you have to make with the system that a company like Meta or Facebook would have, right? You don't know how their internal sharding systems work. You don't know how their data is distributed. You have no idea. You're just kind of guessing. And what I think you did really well was asking very, very specific questions at the beginning to try and get as much information as you can, as much information as is reasonable to get in that amount of time, right? And otherwise, stating whatever assumptions that you are making, if there are holes that you feel like you're kind of glossing over with whatever you think is going on in Facebook's system. I think that's totally fair. And it also, as you think out loud about these things, it shows the interviewer that that you are not only you not only know the gaps in your knowledge, but you're filling them in with reasonable assumptions that work for the situation at hand. I think that's great. Number two, there were a lot of things that I didn't even have to ask you a follow-up because you got there you beat me to the punch basically in addressing something pretty quickly. And I think that's fantastic. It just shows the interviewer that you know how to drive the discussion and you know what is needed to be able to answer a question that is this big and complex. I think those were things that you did really well. I think it's always a great sign for me, the interviewer, when I am asked questions right at the beginning that I'm stumped by. I'm like, I didn't even think about that. When you ask the question about metrics of success, I'm like, actually, this would help in designing the right system and figuring out what trade-offs we want to make. But yeah, if I don't have an answer for you at the moment, I think it's a great sign that you know what you're talking about, and it signals that you're aware that you have experience in this kind of work, and that you're aware of how important a question like that is in the direction of a systems design. So yeah, thank you. I think. Sorry, say that again.
Thank you for the feedback.
Of course. I think this is going to be super valuable for everyone who's watching this at home. So thank you very much for your time, Tanya.
Thank you.
And good luck with your interviews.